The last bird to drink from the lake did so just before dawn. She was a painted stork, white-feathered and long-legged, standing at the edge of a vast inland sea that stretched so far across the flat earth that on clear days its far shore disappeared entirely into the shimmer of distance. She had stood in water like this every morning of her life, and her mother before her, and her mother's mother, in an unbroken chain of mornings that reached back beyond memory. The water was warm around her ankles. The air smelled of wet grass and night-blooming flowers. Somewhere behind her, in the dark reeds that lined the shore, a family of hippopotamuses breathed slowly, their enormous bodies half submerged, their exhalations rising in quiet clouds of mist. The stars above were still bright, the sky still the deep blue of the last hour before light, and everything was exactly as it had always been. She dipped her beak, she drank, she lifted her head and looked out across the water, and for a long moment she was still. Then something changed. It was not something you could see, it was not something you could hear. It was a feeling, perhaps, the kind of feeling that moves through a flock before the storm arrives, before the thunder, before any human sense could detect the shift. Her feathers lifted slightly along her back. Her eyes, amber and ancient, scanned the horizon without finding what they searched for. And then, without any visible reason, she opened her wings and rose from the water's edge, climbing slowly into the dark air, circling once above the lake that had always been there, and flew south. She did not come back. Let that image settle around you now, like a breath released slowly in a quiet room. You are far from the noise of the world. There is nothing required of you here. Simply allow this story to carry you, gently, into a place very far away and very long ago, when the world looked nothing like we might imagine it. The painted stork had flown from the shore of what we now call the Sahara Desert. But to call it a desert in that time would have been not merely inaccurate but almost absurd. It would have been like calling the ocean dry, for the Sahara in those long ago millennia was not sand. It was not emptiness. It was not silence or heat or the vast, pale, featureless waste that fills the imagination when we speak that name today. The Sahara, in the age we are entering now, was one of the most lush and breathtaking landscapes that has ever existed on this earth. This is the story of that world and of how it ended. But first, let us go back further, much further, to when the world was green, and the people who lived within it did not yet know that anything could end. Picture the land as it was, 8,000 years before that quiet dawn, before the bird's departure, before the first grain of sand began its slow accumulation. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the image come softly. The sky is enormous here. In the northern reaches of Africa, the sky has always been enormous, the horizon impossibly wide, the air impossibly clean. But now in this earlier time, the sky does not rise above brown emptiness. It rises above green. An undulating, breathing, rustling, sun-drenched green that extends in every direction without limit, broken only by the silver threads of rivers, by the dark blue mirrors of lakes, by the occasional golden stretch of open savanna, where the grasses grow so tall they brush the belly of a walking giraffe. The rivers run everywhere. Some are small, quick, cold, sparkling things that emerge from rocky outcroppings and chase each other downhill through stands of acacia and wild fig. Others are wide and slow and brown, like the thoughts of something very old and very calm, winding across the land in great loops and curves, carrying with them the silt of distant highlands, the seeds of 10,000 plants, the reflection of 10,000 clouds. Lakes fill the low places, not small puddles, not temporary pools that appear and vanish with the seasons, but true inland seas, some of them the size of countries. Their shores lined with papyrus reeds and date palms, their surfaces busy with birds, their depths filled with fish that have never been seen by human eyes in the centuries to come. The rain comes in seasons, reliable and generous. It comes from the south, pulled northward by the particular tilt of the earth and the particular way the sun's heat draws moisture up from the equatorial forests and sends it rolling across the land in soft, gray curtains. When the rain arrives, the air smells of iron and earth and something sweet that has no name. The animals lift their heads and turn toward it. The children run out from under whatever shelter they have made and stand with their arms extended, their faces upturned, their eyes closed, laughing. This is the African humid period. This is the Green Sahara, and it was real. Science has given us its bones. Pollen preserved in ancient lake sediments, the bleached shells of freshwater snails found beneath 1,000 feet of desert sand, the fossilized roots of trees discovered in places where nothing has grown for 5,000 years. The evidence is everywhere, once you know to look. The Sahara holds its own memory, buried deep, quiet, waiting. And what that memory says is this. For nearly 10,000 years, from roughly 14,500 years ago until approximately 5,000 years ago, the region that is now the world's largest hot desert was instead a place of extraordinary biological abundance. But we are not here for the science alone. We are here for the feeling of it, for the weight of it, for the long, slow, heartbreaking beauty of something precious that existed in full, magnificent bloom. And then, with a gentleness almost more devastating than violence, quietly ceased to be. So let us walk into it. Let us feel the grass beneath our feet. Breathe in, slowly. Imagine the air warm, but not harsh, carrying on it the scent of water and vegetation. Feel the ground beneath you. Not sand, not dust, but soil, dark and rich, held together by the roots of grasses and wildflowers. There are beetles here. There are earthworms. There are the tiny, intricate communities of life that exist only where moisture is consistent and generous, where the earth is given enough time and enough rain to become deep and alive. We are standing near the edge of what would one day become the Libyan desert, but for now it is an open landscape of scattered trees and long grasses, and ahead of us, perhaps half a morning's walk away, we can see the glint of water. A family is moving in that direction. There are perhaps 12 of them, though it is difficult to count as they move through the tall grass. Adults and children together, following a path that generations of feet have worn into the earth. Not a road, not a trail in any formal sense, but a line of memory, a direction passed from grandparent to grandchild through the simple act of walking it again and again. They carry things. A woman near the front has a clay pot balanced on her head, her neck long and graceful, her stride even and unhurried. Two men on either side of the group carry lightweight spears, not because there is immediate danger, but because there is always the possibility of it, and also because a spear is useful for many things beyond protection. For fishing, for pushing through dense reeds, for gesturing at something in the distance when words are not enough. The children move as children always have, which is to say they move in every direction at once. A boy of perhaps 8 years stops to examine something in the grass. An insect perhaps, or a small lizard, or simply an interestingly shaped stone. He holds it up to the light. His sister calls to him. He pockets the stone and runs to catch up, his feet quick and light over the earth. We do not know their language. We will never know it. No record of it exists, no written form, no carved symbol that might carry its sound forward into future centuries. But we know that they had language because all the evidence of their lives, the tools they made, the choices they made, the communities they maintained, points to minds as complex and capable as any mind that would come after them. They told stories. They had names for things. They had opinions about the best fishing spots and the best times of year to travel and the best way to prepare a certain kind of root that grew near the lake's eastern shore. They argued sometimes. They laughed. They grieved. They were, in every way that matters, people. Their world was also, in every way that matters, extraordinary. You may want to settle in now if you haven't already. Find a comfortable position. Let your body grow a little heavier. The story will continue at its own pace, unhurried, and you need not hold on to any of it too tightly. Let it wash over you like warm water. The lake toward which the family walks is one of hundreds in this region. The largest of them, which would eventually be given the name Lake Megachad by the scientists who would discover its ghost thousands of years later, is so vast that standing on one shore and looking out across its surface, you might genuinely believe you were standing beside an ocean. It covers an area larger than the present-day Caspian Sea at its height. Its waters warm and shallow in some places, deeper and cooler in others, its shoreline a complex, ever-changing geography of beaches, wetlands, reed beds, and rocky outcroppings. The fish are phenomenal. Nile perch, tilapia, catfish, species that today exist only in rivers far to the east and south, species whose fossilized bones have been found in the dry rock of what is now the Central Sahara, hundreds of miles from any water source. There are crocodiles here, long and patient, drifting through the shallows with the ancient, unhurried confidence of animals that have changed very little in 60 million years. Hippopotamuses in numbers that would astonish even a modern observer. Their bodies like smooth gray boulders, half submerged in the afternoon heat. Their calls echoing across the water in the deep, reverberant tones that no other animal on Earth quite replicates. Above the water, birds beyond counting. Flamingos in their thousands, standing in the shallows in great pink masses, their collective murmur like distant applause. Herons, motionless as sculptures along the reed beds, their patience a kind of philosophy. Kingfishers, brief flashes of impossible blue and orange, here and gone before the eye can fully register them. The air is thick with wings and calls and the constant movement of life, finding its own level, its own path, its own moment in the sun. And yet, as rich as the lakeside life is, the inland savanna is equally alive. The grasslands of the Green Sahara supported animal populations that rival anything that exists in Africa today. Elephants move through in herds of 30, 40, 50 individuals, their footsteps leaving shallow depressions in the earth that filled with rainwater after storms and became temporary pools where smaller animals gathered to drink. Giraffes reached into the upper branches of acacia trees with tongues the color of storm clouds, their long necks swaying with the gentle, dreamlike grace that seems almost too beautiful to be practical. Buffalo grazed in the open areas. Wild cattle, species long since gone from this region, wandered in loose groups through the long grass. The predators were here too, of course. Lions rested in the shade of isolated trees during the heat of the day, their breathing slow and deep, their golden flanks rising and falling, their eyes half closed but never entirely so. Leopards moved through the night, invisible and silent, known mainly by the sounds of what happened when they found what they were looking for. Hunting dogs, painted dogs with their extraordinary patterned coats and their fierce social loyalty, ranged across the grasslands in packs, hunting with a cooperative intelligence that made them among the most effective predators in the landscape. Into this world, the early humans fit as naturally as any other species. They were not visitors. They were not conquerors. They were part of it, embedded in it, shaped by it in the deepest possible ways. Their bodies knew this landscape. Their minds were structured around it. The rhythms of their days, when to move, when to stay, when to fish, when to hunt, when to gather the wild grains that grew in abundance along the lake margins, were the rhythms of the land itself. Archaeological excavations across the Sahara have given us glimpses of these lives. Stone tools recovered from ancient lake beds, grinding stones for processing wild grain, worn smooth in the center from thousands of uses. Fragments of pottery, some of the earliest pottery ever made, decorated with the imprints of woven baskets pressed into the wet clay before firing. A kind of accidental art that carries forward into the present, the texture of baskets long since dissolved, a record of craft in the negative space of its own impression. And the bones, human bones, animal bones, mixed together in the sediment of dried lake beds and ancient campfire sites. The bones tell their own kind of story. They speak of diets rich in fish and meat and wild plant foods. They speak of communities large enough to sustain specialized skills. This person knew how to make pots, this one how to tan hides, this one how to navigate by the stars and remember the routes between distant water sources. They speak of children who survived into adulthood in reasonable numbers, of adults who sometimes lived to old age, of a baseline of health and nutrition that was by any measure good. This was not a life of constant hardship. This was not survival in the narrow, desperate sense we sometimes imagine for ancient peoples. This was life in full, complicated, sometimes difficult, sometimes dangerous, but also rich with meaning and relationship and the deep, embodied pleasure of being a living thing in a world that is generous enough to sustain you. Let the scene breathe for a moment. Imagine the late afternoon light over the lake, that particular golden quality that happens in the last hours before sunset, when the air is warm and the shadows are long, and everything seems to glow from within. The family has reached the water's edge. The children run straight in, shrieking with pleasure. The adults set down their things with a particular relief of bodies that have walked a long distance and can finally rest. A fire will be built later. Fish will be caught or traded for with other families whose camps are visible further along the shoreline. The stars will come out, as they always do, as thick and close as they ever are from any place on earth that has not learned yet to drown them in artificial light. The night will be long and warm and full of sound. The hippos in the water, the frogs in the reeds, the distant call of something moving through the darkness beyond the firelight. And tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, for a very, very long time. Breathe, settle. There is nothing to rush toward. The story is here, and it is not going anywhere. Let your thoughts slow a little. Let the lake be the last thing in your mind before the next sentence arrives. The first signs came so quietly that no one noticed them as signs at all. A season, perhaps, when the rains arrived a little later than usual. Not dramatically late, just a few weeks, maybe a little more. The grasses grew, but they grew shorter. The lake level dropped, but only by a hand's width or two along the shore, just enough that the regular fishing spots required wading a little farther out than was strictly comfortable. People adjusted, as people do, because adjustment is one of the things people do most naturally and most well. They fished a little farther out. They moved their camps slightly closer to the water's edge. They noted, perhaps, with the careful environmental attention of people whose lives depend on accurate observation, that the rains were late, and they waited. The rains came. They were not quite as generous as they had been in previous years, but they came, and the grasses recovered, and the lakes refilled to something close to their usual level, and life resumed its familiar patterns. The memory of the shorter season faded. It became simply one of those years, the kind of thing that happens sometimes, a brief fluctuation in the long, reliable music of the climate. This is how gradual change works, when it is truly gradual. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the drama of a single decisive event. It comes instead the way sleep comes, not as a moment, but as a process, so slow and continuous that the boundary between waking and not waking is impossible to locate precisely. It comes while attention is turned elsewhere. It comes in the space between one breath and the next, accumulated over so many breaths that by the time anyone might notice, it has already been going on for a very long time. The cause of what was coming lay not in the land itself, and not in anything the people who lived on it had done or failed to do. It lay in the heavens, specifically in the mathematics of the Earth's slow journey through space. The Earth does not maintain a perfectly consistent relationship with the Sun. Its orbit shifts over thousands of years, describing a slow, subtle wobble. The tilt of its axis changes, by tiny increments, over cycles that span tens of thousands of years. These changes are so small in any single century as to be effectively invisible, but accumulated over millennia, they alter the distribution of sunlight across the planet's surface in ways that are decisive and profound. Around 10,000 years ago, the particular combination of orbital factors that had drawn the summer monsoons deep into the African continent began, slowly and incrementally, to reverse. The Earth's axial tilt, which had been slightly more pronounced than it is in our own era, began to decrease. The timing of the Earth's closest approach to the Sun shifted relative to the seasons. The summer sun in the northern hemisphere received slightly less energy than it had before. And that slight reduction, expressed across thousands of square miles and thousands of years, began to weaken the great atmospheric engine that pulled the monsoon rains northward into the Sahara. The weakening was not sudden. It was not catastrophic. It was, from year to year, essentially imperceptible. The rains still came, the lakes still filled, the grasses still grew. But each year, on average, the rains came a little shorter, reached a little less far north, carried a little less water. Each year the lakes lost a little more than they gained. Each year the soils in the northernmost reaches of the Green Sahara held a little less moisture through the dry season. And the land responded. Vegetation changes are among the first visible signs of shifting climate, because plants are honest in a way that weather is not. They do not fluctuate. They do not have good years and bad years in the way that rainfall does. They simply grow where conditions permit their growth, and where conditions no longer permit, they stop. The most moisture-dependent species went first. The tree species that required reliable rainfall throughout the growing season, the riverside plants that needed permanent water, the deep-rooted grasses that held the soil in place through dry periods. Where those species retreated, other things moved in. Hardier grasses, shrubs adapted to longer dry seasons, species that could dormant through extended drought and spring back when the rains arrived, however briefly. The landscape was not yet desert, not by any measure, but it was changing, shifting, adapting, as all living systems adapt, finding new equilibria in the altered conditions. The animals noticed before the people did, in the sense that the animals responded with their bodies before the people responded with their minds. Migratory patterns shifted. Species that required permanent water began to concentrate around the most reliable sources. The largest lakes, the deepest rivers, the places where underground aquifers kept the vegetation green through the dry season even when surface water was scarce. Species that could tolerate greater aridity expanded their ranges northward, following the retreating grassland, finding in the newly drier lands a habitat they were suited for. The elephants moved, not all at once. Elephants do not move all at once. They move in the way that large things move, which is slowly and with great deliberateness, following food and water across distances that humans would have to plan for weeks in advance. But over generations, the elephant herds that had moved freely across the Green Sahara began to shift south and east, following the moisture, following the trees, following the deep instinct that says, go where things grow. The giraffes followed, the lions followed, the painted dogs ranged further and further south in their hunting, and the distance between one pack's territory and the next grew greater. The biodiversity of the landscape was compressing, concentrating, pooling around the remaining sources of reliable water, while the spaces between grew quieter and more sparse. The people noticed all of this. Of course they did. These were not incurious or inattentive people. They were people who read the land the way we read text, quickly, fluently, picking up information in every glance, every smell, every change in the quality of the air or the color of the horizon. They noticed that the elephants had not come through this season. They noticed that the lake shore was further from their camp than it had been in their grandparents' time. They noticed that the particular gathering ground where their grandmothers had collected wild grain in abundance was now producing less, the plants smaller and sparser than the stories said they had once been. They talked about it. They argued about it. They told stories about it. Stories that carried, in the way that oral traditions carry everything, the memory of how things had been and the question of what was becoming. Some of them moved, following the patterns they had always followed but traveling further, staying at the reliable places longer, expanding their sense of what was normal territory for their group. Others stayed because the places they lived were still, for now, productive enough, and because home is not always a rational calculation but an emotional one, a matter of belonging as much as of resources. This is the part of the story that asks the most of us as witnesses, because it requires us to hold two things at once: the grandeur of deep geological time, in which the changes happening here were relatively swift by the standards of planetary history, and the intimate scale of human lives, in which these same changes were occurring across 10 and 15 and 20 human generations. Each generation knowing only a small increment of the shift. none of them able to see the full arc. Imagine living through a chapter of a book without knowing it is a chapter, without knowing there is a book. You experience your life as a life, specific, immediate, full of its own concerns and joys and griefs. The lake is smaller than your grandmother described it, yes. The rains have been unreliable for several years now. But other years the rains have been generous, and the lake has risen almost to where it used to be. And you have thought, perhaps things are returning. Perhaps this difficult stretch is ending, and then the next dry season comes, and the lake drops again, further than it dropped the year before. Let this sit with you quietly. There is no urgency in it. It happened as all things happen, in real time, across real lives, felt not as history, but as weather, as the particular texture of one's particular days. Breathe slowly. The story continues. There is a figure I keep returning to in my imagination of this world. A woman in her middle years, standing on a rocky outcrop above what was once a lake basin. The date, if we were to assign one, might be somewhere around 6,000 years ago in the later stages of the African humid period, when the changes have accumulated enough to be unmistakable, but the world is still, in many places, livable and green. She is painting. On the rock face behind her, there are already many paintings, images accumulated over generations, images placed here by people who came before her and stood on this same ledge and looked out over this same landscape and felt the same impulse to make the invisible visible, to press the experience of seeing into the surface of the world. There are cattle here, rendered in ochre and white in dark mineral black. There are human figures, stylized and graceful, dancing or herding or reaching towards something the painter imagined or remembered or hoped for. There are fish, large-finned and clearly rendered with the eye of someone who spent much time watching fish move through clear water. There are hippos, round and calm. There is a hunter paused in mid-stride. There is a family, small figures clustered together, and above them something that might be the sun or might be a star, or might be simply the painter's sense that light ought to appear in the place where life is happening. Our woman is adding to this gallery. She is painting cattle, not because she imagines them or hopes for them, but because she has them. A small herd of perhaps 15 animals, descendant from the early domesticated cattle that had begun to appear in this region some thousands of years ago, when people first discovered that certain animals, kept close and fed and protected, could provide ongoing sustenance more reliable than the hunt. Her cattle are important. They are mobile wealth, mobile food, mobile relationship. You can give a cow as a gift, as a bride price, as compensation for an injury, as an act of friendship. Her cattle go where she goes, and she goes further now than her grandmother went. The old camping places to the north are no longer viable. The water sources there have dwindled to seasonal trickles, the vegetation too sparse to support her herd through the dry months. She ranges south and east, following routes that her community is still in the process of establishing. Routes that will eventually become paths worn deep into the earth by the passage of many feet over many generations, and which those future generations will follow, not because they remember why they were made, but because they are there. She paints her cattle because she loves them, in the particular way that you love the things your life depends on and which depend in turn on you. She gives them colors and proportions that anyone who had ever spent time around real cattle would immediately recognize as accurate. The set of the shoulders, the curve of the horn, the specific way a large-bodied animal carries its head when it is calm and unhurried. She uses a brush made from plant fibers, or perhaps her fingers, pressing the ochre paste into the slight pores of the rock face with practiced care. When she is done, she steps back and looks at what she has made, and then she looks out at the landscape below her, and for a moment she holds both images, the painting and the world it came from, in her gaze at once. The lake below is still there, but it is smaller. She can see where the old waterline was, a faint, darker stain on the rock face at the far shore, perhaps 2 body lengths above the current water level. The reed beds that used to extend far into the shallows have retreated. There are patches of pale, cracked earth visible now at the lake's edge that in her childhood were underwater. She turns back to her painting. She adds one more animal, a calf, small and carefully rendered, standing close to its mother. Then she climbs down from the ledge and returns to her camp, and the painting stays, exactly as she left it, while the world around it slowly changes. Those rock paintings are real. They exist across the Sahara in their thousands. In the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, in the Fezzan region of Libya, in the Tibesti Mountains of Chad, in countless other locations across the vast terrain that was once green and is now dust. They are among the most remarkable cultural artifacts humanity has produced, not because of their technical sophistication, though many of them are genuinely beautiful, but because of what they record. A world that no longer exists, preserved in pigment and stone, still visible to those who travel to see them. The cattle paintings are especially revealing. They show a pastoral culture of considerable complexity, people who had domesticated cattle and organized their lives around the animals' needs and movements, following the grasses and water sources across the landscape in seasonal patterns that were not random wandering but carefully managed migratory cycles. This way of life, mobile pastoralism, was ideally suited to an environment that was generous but not uniform, where the best resources in any one place were seasonal and temporary, and the key to thriving was knowing when to move and where to go. It was also, as it turned out, a way of life that would prove crucial to survival as the climate shifted, because it was flexible in exactly the ways that a changing world required. The pastoralists moved. They were used to moving. Moving was not for them a crisis or a defeat. It was simply what you did when the land told you it was time. The land was telling them that now, more insistently with each passing generation. Let your body be heavy now. Let the images soften slightly at their edges. The story is moving into its quieter passages, not the dramatic transformation, not the sudden change, but the long, slow, dignified movement of people and animals and knowledge across a landscape that is becoming something other than what it was. Communities that had been relatively settled near the major lake systems began to dissolve and reconsolidate. Families that had spent generations in one place found reasons to visit cousins who lived further south, and the visits grew longer, and eventually the visits became the life, and the old places became simply somewhere that was remembered, somewhere the stories were set, somewhere the painting rocks still held the images of cattle and fish and dancing figures from a time when the world was different. New territories were negotiated, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not. The great concentrations of people around the shrinking lakes created pressures that abundance had previously diffused. More people competing for the same fish, the same game, the same pasture for their cattle. Archaeological evidence from this period shows some increase in conflict, in the defensive placement of settlements, in the careful management of water sources that had previously been shared without much governance because there had simply been enough for everyone. But what is also evident, and what is perhaps more remarkable, is the degree to which people managed, adapted, continued. The communities that moved southward carried their knowledge with them. They carried their cattle and their pottery traditions and their methods of processing wild grain. They carried, eventually, the beginnings of a more systematic approach to agriculture. The deliberate cultivation and encouragement of wild grains that would, over subsequent centuries, develop into the agricultural traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, and eventually, through a complex web of migration and cultural exchange, contribute to the agricultural foundations of ancient Egypt. The Nile Valley, in fact, may owe some portion of its extraordinary early dynamism to this migration. As the Sahara dried and its human populations were pushed toward the reliable water of the Great River, the Nile Valley received an influx of people bringing diverse skills, traditions, knowledge systems, and crucially, already sophisticated relationships with cattle and food-producing plants. Some researchers have suggested that the transition from the Green Sahara to the desert pushed people toward the Nile in sufficient numbers and with sufficient accumulated knowledge to contribute meaningfully to the extraordinary flowering of civilization that would occur there in subsequent millennia. This is, if you sit with it for a moment, a strangely beautiful idea. The dying of one world is the seed of another. The movement of loss becoming the carrier of possibility. But we are not quite there yet. We are still in the Sahara, still watching the last of the green give way. The final centuries of the African humid period, roughly between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago, saw an acceleration of the processes that had been building for millennia. The orbital forcing that had weakened the monsoon reached a threshold at which the effects became self-reinforcing. This is one of the stranger and more haunting aspects of the Sahara's story. The climate system did not simply change gradually and continuously. There is evidence that in certain regions, the transition from grassland to desert happened with remarkable speed. Not overnight, not in a single season, but over decades rather than centuries, driven by feedback loops that amplified the initial change into something much faster. The mechanism works like this. Vegetation, particularly in semi-arid regions, plays a crucial role in maintaining the climate that sustains it. Plants release moisture into the air through transpiration. They create shade that reduces surface temperatures and slows evaporation from the soil. Their roots hold the soil together, preventing dust from forming and blowing. And crucially, vegetation-covered ground absorbs more solar radiation than bare soil. It is darker, and dark surfaces absorb heat more efficiently, creating the warm rising air that helps draw in moisture-laden air from the ocean. When vegetation begins to disappear, whether from reduced rainfall, overgrazing, or any other cause, these moderating effects are reduced. The soil becomes paler as it dries. Pale surfaces reflect more solar radiation, cooling the land surface and reducing the temperature differential that draws in the monsoon. Less moisture is released into the air. The dust that forms and blows from bare soil further brightens the atmosphere, reflecting still more radiation. The net result is a drier, hotter land surface that is even less hospitable to vegetation, which means less vegetation, which means drier and hotter conditions, which means still less vegetation. In a land already approaching the boundary of what vegetation can sustain, this feedback can tip the system from one stable state to another with a speed that feels, on a human timescale, almost sudden. There may have been families living on the margins of the changing land in this final period who experienced something close to what we imagined in the opening of this story. A season in which the rains simply did not come, or came so briefly and so lightly that they could not even wet the cracked surface of the earth before the sun reclaimed them. A season in which the lake that had been retreating for as long as anyone could remember, retreated still further and did not come back. And they realized, in that quiet, terrible, irrevocable way that realization sometimes arrives, that it was not coming back. The birds left, not the painted stork alone, but the herons and the flamingos and the kingfishers, following the water south, following the fish south, finding the Nile Valley and the remaining lakes and the rivers of Central Africa, and becoming residents of those places. Their descendants living there still, with no memory of the great lakes they came from. The crocodiles went too, though more slowly, following the retreating river systems. Today, populations of crocodiles exist in isolated, landlocked pools in the central Sahara, the last remnant populations of a species that once ranged freely across a well-watered continent, now marooned by the advancing desert, living in diminishing pockets of water that have no connection to any larger system, surrounded by miles and miles of sand. The dunes came. They came not from nothing. The sand had always been there, in a sense, locked into the soil particles in riverbeds and lake sediments, held in place by roots and moisture. But roots and moisture were gone now, and with them the thing that held the sand still. The wind, which had always blown across the Sahara, but which had previously been broken and slowed by vegetation, now moved freely across bare surfaces, and it moved the sand. Grain by grain the dunes built. First small ripples in the open places between the last struggling grasses, then larger forms, accumulating in the lee of rocks or the remains of dried root systems, growing slowly into the flowing, sculpted forms that we recognize today. The rock paintings remained. The carved surfaces of the boulders, where generations of human hands had pressed their experience into stone, were covered, in some places, by the advancing sand, and preserved by that covering, waiting for the desert to give them back someday to other hands that would come and find them and be astonished. In other places, they stayed exposed to the open air, slowly losing color under the sun, slowly being abraded by wind-blown sand, but slowly enough that some of them persist even now. Faint images of cattle and fish and dancing figures, and the lives of people who knew a world that no longer exists. There is a particular quality to these images that photographs don't fully capture, or so it is said by those who have made the difficult journey to see them in person. Standing before them, on the bare rock of a landscape that is now among the driest on earth, you are confronted with the full weight of the distance between the world the painter inhabited and the world you are standing in. The same rock, the same sky, more or less, though the stars are still there even if the moisture is long gone. But everything else, the cattle, the lake, the reeds, the fish, the families moving across the grass, the whole dense, living, breathing world, all of it is gone. Not destroyed, not obliterated, simply gone. In the way that things go when time is long enough and conditions change enough. The life moved elsewhere. It continued. It became other things in other places. The pastoralists who left the Sahara became the ancestors of many of the peoples who live across the Sahel and the savanna zones of West and East Africa today, carrying with them traditions and cattle breeds and ways of reading landscape that developed in the Green Sahara and adapted as they moved south. The fishermen of the Great Lakes became fishermen of the Nile and the Niger and the Congo. The knowledge of pottery and grain processing and cattle herding that developed in the Green Sahara flowed into the broader human story and contributed to everything that came after. Nothing was lost without remainder, but the world itself, the specific, irreplaceable 9,000-year-old world of the Green Sahara, that world ended. And the ending was quiet, as true endings often are. Not a cataclysm, not a fire or a flood or a sudden catastrophic event. Just the long, patient withdrawal of water from a landscape that had held it for 9,000 years. The slow whitening of the sky, the slow silencing of the animal calls, the slow disappearance of the grasses and the trees and the flowers, until what remained was the rock and the sand and the wind and the sun and the faint, barely visible images of cattle pressing against a rock face, proof that once, here, there was life. There is something in this that speaks to the deepest nature of things. Not a sad thing exactly, or not only sad, but something vast and calm. Worlds begin, worlds end. The thing that animated them does not disappear but moves, transforms, finds new expression in new places and new times. The painted stork who left the lake that last morning found another lake, perhaps, or a river, and drank again. And her daughters drank, and their daughters after them, all the way down to the birds that lift from the Nile's banks in the present moment, carrying in their bodies the distant inheritance of a world none of them remember. The families who walked south, who folded their lives into new landscapes, who taught their children new routes and new water sources and new ways of reading a drier sky, those families continued. Their knowledge of cattle, their knowledge of craft, their love of painting on stone, their capacity to make meaning and community and beauty in whatever conditions they found themselves. All of it continued. The Sahara itself continues in its own way. It breathes very slowly across timescales that dwarf human civilization. The same orbital mathematics that dim the monsoon will, in some tens of thousands of years, cycle around again. The axial tilt will shift. The summer sun in the northern hemisphere will strengthen. The great atmospheric engine will reawaken, and the rains will come back. The seeds that have been waiting, buried in the ancient soil beneath the sand, preserved in the darkness and the dryness, will feel the moisture and respond. The grasses will return. The animals will follow. The lakes will refill, slowly across centuries until the desert is green again, as it was, as it will be, as the Earth's long, patient rhythms continue their ancient mathematics. We will not see it. No one alive now will see it, but it is coming, in the way that all things that have been come again, given enough time and the right turning of the world. For now, though, the Sahara is what it is, a vast, silent, sun-filled space of extraordinary beauty, holding beneath its sands the memory of everything it was. The dry riverbeds are still there, if you look from the right height. The branching patterns of ancient watercourses, perfectly preserved in the rock beneath the sand, visible from above like the memory of a circulatory system, a body's map of itself from a time when it was full and flowing. The fossil shells of freshwater snails lie in the dry desert soil, turned up sometimes by the wind, small curved white things that have no business being there, far from any water, reminders of the lake that was and the small lives that moved through it. The rock art remains fading slowly in the desert air, the cattle and the fish and the dancers and the hunters still pressing their outlines against the stone, still saying, "We were here, we lived here. This was our world." And the desert holds all of it, gently, the way deep time holds everything. Not with grief exactly, but with a kind of enormous, impersonal tenderness. Everything that has been is still in some sense here, changed in form perhaps, buried perhaps, shifted in its location and expression, but present in the way that things are always present in the substrate of the world, in the chemistry of the soil, in the genetic memory of the organisms that descended from the organisms of that time, in the slow orbital mathematics that made it and unmade it and will, someday, make it again. Close your eyes now, if they aren't already closed. You have traveled a long way, across 5,000 years and more. You have stood at the edge of a lake that no longer exists and watched a bird rise into a sky that still does. You have walked through grass that has long since become dust and sat beside fires whose ash became soil, became sand. You have seen the paintings on the rock, felt the clay of the pottery wet under the maker's hands, heard the distant sound of cattle moving through grass in the long golden light of a late afternoon in a world so different from our own that it requires an act of genuine imagination to enter it. And yet it was real as any world that has ever been, as full of life and meaning and love and grief and the ordinary, extraordinary weight of being alive. The lake is empty now. The reeds are gone. The flamingos are gone. The hippos are gone. And the elephants and the giraffes and the painted dogs and the children running into the water at the end of a long day's walk. But the stars are the same stars that hung over the camp of the family by the lake shore, hang now over the desert that replaced it. The same mathematics that govern the tides and the seasons governed then. The same breath that moves through you now moved through the lungs of the woman on the rock ledge, painting her cattle in the last good centuries, pressing ochre against stone with a steady, practiced hand. You are part of this long, continuous story. Your breath is part of it. Your body is made of atoms that have been through every configuration the earth has tried, every form that life has taken, every world that has come and gone and come again. There is nothing to hold on to in that thought and nothing to fear in it. It is simply the truth of things, spacious and quiet and very still. Let the Sahara settle around you in its immensity, not the desert, or not only the desert, but the whole of what it has been and what it contains. The buried lakes, the fossil rivers, the ochre cattle on the stone, the seeds waiting in the dark beneath the sand. Let your thoughts slow the way water slows when it enters a wide, shallow basin. Let them spread out and become still and reflect the sky. You have walked a long way tonight, across grass and sand and time, and the particular beauty of a world that knew how to hold life generously and how to let it go. Rest now. The stars are out over the desert, and they are very bright, and they are very quiet, and they have been watching over this place for a very long time. They will keep watch tonight while you sleep.